Welcome to the Silurians for the fall season. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Alan Dodds Frank, and I have the privilege of being the president of this great, august group. And I'm so glad you're all here to hear Lynn Sherr, who's going to be just wonderful, as always. But let me get through a little business in the meantime. First, I'd like to welcome some new members. Jane Sassine, who was a longtime reporter at Business Week. You may have met her at the last lunch. She's now the founding director of the McGraw Center for Business Journalism at CUNY. Kathleen Brady, reporter at Women's Wear Daily for many years, who is, and then at Time, she's here. Kathleen, where are you? There you are. A recruit by Mort Scheinman, our longtime stalwart and former president. Frank Giacomo, Frank, are you here? Guess not. Anyway, he's a writer whose byline you will know from the New York Observer, the Vanity Fair, the New York Post, Daily News, Billboard, etc. Graciela Rogerio, a producer and writer at WABC, who is here. McGee Hickey, stand up, please. Another relatively new member. McGee Hickey is already on the course of recruiting. Graciela, yeah. And next to Graciela, we have Rita Sachs, who is a Silurian Award winner once upon a time. Rita. And Jill Friedman, a freelance photojournalist. Jill, welcome. You can see her work at MoMA, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, etc. Anyway, I also am sad to report. Oh, I'm sorry. Please stand up. No. Excuse me. Better that I missed you in that category than the next, which is unfortunately I have a couple of deaths of members to report since our last meeting. Fred Ferguson, who many of you knew, who was a second-generation Silurian and a board member, a longtime reporter at UPI, and then a PR Newswire guy for a long time. And Nancy Dunnan, who was a business writer and editor and publisher of Travel Smart, and wrote more than 30 books, including the Dun & Bradstreet Guide to Your Investments, etc. Anyway, let's have a moment of silence for our former departed members. Thank you. Now, you may have noticed that we now have name tags. And there's a big bowl here on the front table. And First Vice President Betsy Ashton, who is in charge of the name tag project, wants you to surrender yours when you leave. Mort Scheinman, the membership chairman, asked me to remind those few of you who might not have paid your dues for this year yet to please do so. And the new members, when they pay their dues, they get carried through next year. That's the good news. Now it's time for Lynn, the headliner. She's such a courageous person and reporter. Her career is so great. I could spend all day telling you about it, but I think many of you know many parts of it. But I'm just going to start with Philadelphia, where she was born. And her father was a famous professional basketball player in the Jewish leagues and then the forerunner of the NBA, I guess. And he and her mother raised Lynn and her sister. Then Lynn went off to Wellesley, and then she won a college magazine editors contest, which I will let her tell you about, and the source of her first great journalistic boondoggle. I mean, if you're going to be a world-class boondoggler, you might as well start with a trip to Rome. and she went to the AP and bounced around Condé Nast, WCBS, public television, and then just 3 lousy decades at ABC, where she, of course, was tremendously effective and influential, covering space, health, politics, doing all those graphics that were all fake. Nobody knew except Lynn. Well, they weren't fake. They were real. You just couldn't see them if you were actually there in person. They were real graphics. You were correct. I am wrong. She did a story for 2020 that put me off eating warm water oysters for a decade. Probably saved my life and a lot of other people. Anyway, she has so many scoops, I'm not even going to start. As you know, she's written many books. Susan B. Anthony about swimming. She's been a trustee of Wellesley College. She wrote another book about giraffes called Tall Blondes. She wrote a great book about her life called Outside the Box, which I just happen to have here, which I recommend to everybody. And of course, her most recent book is about Sally Ride, who she knew for a long, long time. Thanks to her publisher, we have copies of this book available, and I'm fairly certain we could prevail upon Lynn to sign them, right here for a fabulous price of $17. List price $28. This alone makes it worth being a Silurian. So I hope you'll all come up there right here, and I'll actually put them on the head table, and Betsy will, and I will make sure you pay for them, and then hopefully Lynn will sign them. And I know that's breaking news to Betsy. Anyway, Lynn, please come up and spellbind us. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. I must say that the little bio in the email invitation was as good a bio of me as has ever been written. So I thank you for that and for actually getting it all accurately. I should also tell you, I love the name tag thing. I was about to say recently, it was actually 5 years ago, went to my 50th high school reunion, and we all had name tags, and a little bit of what happened to me when I got here today is what happened to me at the high school reunion, which was you would run into somebody and you'd say, hi. Hi! So, pardon me for looking at your name tags, but I, of course, remember nothing and nobody. But I am so thrilled to see so many of my old pals here from the AP, Claude, and from ABC, John and Marlene and Bill, and it's just great. And Enid, my goodness, Enid and I knew each other when I worked at the AP, and she was at the New York Times, and so many of you I've had so many connections with. So you really are the best, and thank you very much for coming. Alan mentioned my background in Philadelphia, all of which is true. A number of years ago, many years ago, I think when I was still at the AP, I went back to Philadelphia to give a speech at the synagogue where my family had belonged. And someone at a local weekly newspaper called the Jewish Exponent, which we referred to as the news and views of the Philadelphia Jews, asked me if my background had anything to do with my choice of a career, since Jews were always asking questions and answering with questions. I asked him if he was serious. The truth is that probably like every single one of you, I became a reporter for a very corny reason, which was to tell the truth, to help go behind the curtain and expose the wizardry, to find out why and when and where and how, and to help make sense and thus bring some order to what I saw as a distinctly disordered world. By an accident of timing and pure good luck, I have lived the glory years of television news, television network journalism, when news was still recognized as a public story and when getting the story was the only thing that mattered. Someone was interviewing me the other day, thank you, yes. Someone was interviewing me the other day and said, well, you know, it sounds like you had a great career in journalism and TV journalism, but wasn't the golden age of journalism sort of the Murrow years? And I said, frankly, when you have a business where there are no women, no minorities, and where the subjects aren't even covered, that to me is not the golden age of journalism. So I really liked the time that I was a reporter, along with so many of you. And it was also a time when we were reality TV, I might point out. Sometimes, actually, it was too real. One night when I was at ABC, my husband and I went to visit my mother-in-law, and we were at her apartment. It was 6:30 p.m. The news was about to go on, and Larry pointed at the television, and he said, Mom, Lynn's about to be on the news. Let's watch. And it was a rare night where I had already done my piece, and normally you couldn't leave, as you know, while your piece was on the air. But for some reason, my piece was in the can, and it didn't matter, and I was allowed to leave and go. And I went to have dinner with my mother-in-law and my husband. So my piece is about to run, and Diana, my mother-in-law, smiled with great anticipation. At the time, she was in her late 80s after a lifetime of success at a business she had created in the Garment Center. But her body was failing. She rarely left home. A visit from her son always picked up her spirits. The fact that the two of us were together totally made her beam. I was in awe of her guts and her accomplishments. I loved making her happy, and we always let her know when I was on the air because this gave her a big lift. But I'd never been in the same room while it happened. So Larry puts on the television set. I stand aside, watching Peter Jennings open World News Tonight, trying to recall where in the lineup my piece was. Finally, I saw it coming, and I alerted Diana. Here is what happened. She looked at the screen. She heard my voice. She saw me. And then she looked at me. And then she looked at the screen. And then she looked at me. And back and forth for how long were our pieces then? A minute and 20 seconds? I don't think she absorbed one single word of what was in the story. She was totally baffled, back and forth. This incredible woman who had escaped from Russia as a teenager, who had raised a child and run a company all by herself in the New World, could not figure out how I could be on the tube and in her living room at the same time. Which one was the real me? I think it's something like the shadows on the walls of Plato's cave, that television is kind of an alternative reality that doesn't really give you the whole picture. And I also think it's the kind of confusion that results when you step, as I always did, outside the box. And that stepping outside the box is kind of a position or a mindset that I've always adopted as a reality check on the medium. Call it self-preservation, call it mutiny, but I think if you can't keep straight which you is you, then neither one of you has a chance. Because the truth is that in the public mind, television trumps reality every single time. The flip side of the Diana story occurred during an early space shuttle liftoff. I was assigned, it was the first space shuttle liftoff. I was assigned to the VIP area in front of the anchor booth. And of course, our anchor was Frank Reynolds, who was so knowledgeable about space and such a wonderful anchor. Science correspondent was Jules Bergman, the great Jules Bergman. I was the new player on the team. I keep referring to myself as the color guy in the booth. And so I was in the VIP viewing area, and it was my job to sort of find the celebrities, not too much has changed, and put them on the air. So we're on the air live, and Frank throws it to me, and it's in the pre-dawn before that STS-1 went up, the first shuttle in April of 81. And Frank throws it to me, and now we're going to go to Lynn Sherr and see who she's talking to down there. So my producer, so I'm in this little pen of people, and the booth is up, the anchor trailer, of course, is right there. And my producer has her arms spread out like a giant bird, keeping everybody away. And we've got a monitor on the floor, a black and white, sort of an 8-inch monitor on the floor, on the ground. So we're outdoors, so that obviously while the camera's on me, I can look down and see what shot they're taking so I can speak to the shot, whatever it is. And the monitor was angled half towards me and half towards the cameramen in the crowds. And as I spoke into the microphone and delivered whatever vital nugget of news to Frank Reynolds and the world, I noticed that the audience was hushed, waiting for my magic words. And then I was shocked, because even though I was standing 3 feet in front of them in living, breathing color, every single eye was looking down at the 8-inch square black and white television. TV was the reality. Outside the box simply didn't matter. And that's something I learned about television news, that it can be, for all the so-called glamour, it can be a very humbling profession. Before I went to ABC, I was a reporter at Channel 2 News in New York, WCBS TV, and I got a call very early one morning from our assignment desk. There had been one of those miracle, probably the first, microsurgery operations in Brooklyn, and perhaps some of you remembered it and even covered it yourselves. A man's hand had been severed in a machine accident, and they had just reattached his hand. This had never happened before. So I get the call to go out to this hospital in Brooklyn. The crew comes and picks me up. It's quite early, I emphasize. And we get out there, we park in the parking lot, and what does any TV, fancy, glamorous television reporter do? You schlep across the parking lot holding the sticks or holding the camera or holding the film or whatever, and it was film in those days. And we go trudging across, and now we're in the lobby of the hospital. It's me, it's my camera crew, 3-man crew, cameraman, sound man, and lighting guy, and me. And we're trudging along, and some little old guy walks up to me, and he stops. He says, "Say, you're on television, aren't you?" "Yes, sir, I'm on television." Then he says, "Aren't you Lynn Sherr?" And I stood up very straight now, and "Thank you very much. Yes, I am. Thank you for noticing." He looks at me, he squints, he says, "You look better on television." True story. I ran to the ladies' room and put on some makeup. When I left that job, actually I was fired from that job. How do we say it in television? My contract was not renewed. I was fired by a man named Ed Joyce. Feel free to comment. When I left that job and been off the air for several weeks, I was walking down Lexington Avenue near Bloomingdale's. Somebody actually came up to me and said, "Didn't you used to be on television?" Didn't you used to be Lynn Sherr? Excuse me, I blew the line. Didn't you used to be Lynn Sherr? How does one respond? So this has been sort of a theme in my life, which has always been amusing. But then when I graduated from college in 1963, women were not supposed to have careers. We were supposed to marry them. The perennial joke at my alma mater concerned the college motto, which was non ministrare sed ministrare. For those of you without a Latin degree, it's translated literally, not to be ministered unto, but to minister. In other words, not to be passive, but to be active. Thousands of cynical Wellesley students reinterpreted it as not to be ministers, but ministers' wives. My class captured the feeling further with a spoof that showed graduates in training not to be diplomats, but diplomats' wives. You will no doubt sleep much more soundly tonight when you know that neither Madeleine Albright nor Hillary Rodham Clinton was in my class. At any rate, the real world only reinforced that attitude. When I got to New York, like all of my female pals, the doors were slammed shut against hiring women for anything like a serious journalism job. We were told point blank by most news organizations, "We don't hire girls." That's simply the way it was. This is 1963. Time and Newsweek routinely told us that as girls, and that's what they called us and what we called ourselves, we could get hired at the clip desk. Anybody here ever work at a clip desk? Clip desk meant you literally sat at a desk and you clipped articles out of newspapers and magazines, put them in a file so that some guy the exact same age as you with the exact same education, who was called a junior writer, could use them as research and write his articles. This is simply the way it worked. As for television news, forget it. That was another men's club, invented by men, run by men, and aimed at men. And extraordinary as it may seem, it never occurred to any of us to challenge it then. It's just the way things were. I started out in the magazine world because Condé Nast, which, as Alan mentioned, do you remember the Mademoiselle Guest Editor Contest? Mademoiselle magazine had a contest called the Guest Editor Competition, and I won that my junior year in college. And what it was essentially a paid internship, and you worked for the magazine. I was brought to New York along with 19 other girls, and we helped put out the August issue. It was absolutely sensational. And that year, for the first time, Mademoiselle added to what was essentially a month of learning the business and parties all over the city, they added on 5 days in Rome. So I am the only person you know who actually did win a trip to Rome. I'm also the only person you know who was actually on Bandstand, but that's another story. So I came to New York after I graduated, and I went back to Condé Nast, which had been very good to me, and because they understood that women were very good workers who did not demand very high wages. Then I went to the Associated Press, which was at least slightly less threatened by female reporters than the rest of the media. I got into TV in 1972 because another woman, another blonde, the wonderful Pia Lindstrom, my pal, was leaving. And I quickly discovered when I was at audition for the job that everyone being auditioned for the job had hair the same color as Pia's and mine. I got the job, and I always referred to it as the blonde seat at Channel 2 News. If you have to be female, they were saying you had better be blonde. There were some other women there who did not have blonde hair, actually, but that seemed to be the way it worked. If you were a blonde and you left, they got another blonde. So today, of course, so much of that has changed. You can be male or female or anything in between. You can have hair any color. And starting in the 70s, when I got to Channel 2 in 1972, I was there 72 to 74, and that's when the women's movement was really changing things in this country. That's when so many women got into television news, this will not surprise you, because of the goodness of the hearts of the men who ran the networks, but because there were lawsuits. And the lawsuits essentially said, you better do something about this. There were also then finally some tools. 1972, the year I got to Channel 2, was the same year that the wonderful Pat Schroeder first ran for Congress from Colorado. As she campaigned door to door, this very smart politician and mom repeated her mantra, I have a brain and a uterus, and I use them both. Actually, Pat, I once told Pat that I've been using that quote in all my speeches, and I just wanted to triple verify that it was true. Oh, absolutely, she said. And I once came home, and an interview with me had been, Pat said, an interview with her, Pat, had been on the air saying that, and she walked into the house, and her mother looked at her and said, did you really say that? Yes, she did. And then take that other story I used to cover, space. Take the idea that space and space coverage are glamorous. You will recall, of course, that shuttle liftoffs tended to be at the crack of dawn, which meant those anchoring the launches had to be there before the crack of dawn. So one time my husband came down to see the liftoff and me, and found himself driving me to the press site on a really hot, steamy, they were pretty much all hot, steamy, muggy morning, pitch dark in Florida at the Kennedy Space Center. And while he struggled to find the road, I was going over some last-minute notes. As we made our way along the highway, Larry turned to me and said, with his eyes barely open, thank you for sharing the glamorous part of your life. Of course, it really was glamorous, in the very best sense, as all of you know, because as a reporter, I had that proverbial front seat as history unfolded. I covered the first woman to run for vice president of a major party ticket. I explored treatments for everything from anorexia to Gulf War syndrome, and thank goodness, I got to cover the first American woman ever to fly into space. Sally Ride was somebody that I met when I first got sent to NASA. As I said, we had a great space team. Frank and Jules really knew what they were doing. Bob Siegenthaler was the executive producer of special events, and Sieg had covered all the early space liftoff, all the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo missions. And they sort of brought me in. When I wrote my book, which is called Outside the Box, and by the way, every single person in this room should be writing a book, because even though journalist memoirs don't really sell all that well, you have to do it for history, you have to do it for your kids, and you have to do it for you. I really, really urge you all to do it. Anyway, I beg your pardon? Okay. So I called that book Outside the Box, and I talked a little bit about Sally there, and I would have actually liked to have written Sally's biography while she was alive. Sally died 2 years ago, July of 2012, at the age of 61, of pancreatic cancer. She never wanted a biography written while she was alive, and the only reason the biography got written, well, I'll get to that in just a second. So I first met Sally in 1981 when ABC asked me to join the space team. I had done a number of science stories for ABC. Heaven knows why. I am the one who took botany at college instead of physics to fulfill the science requirement. But it was sort of, remember that commercial, you know, let Mikey try the cereal, see if Mikey likes it? I think the feeling was that I was a pretty good explainer, and if I could ask all the dumb questions, and yes, I know there's no such thing as a dumb question, but if I could understand it, then our viewers might be able to understand it, which is sort of the way it worked. NASA, as we all know, which began in 1958, came out of the Cold War, came out of our competition with the Russians, had started as a white men's club, like some other clubs we know about. The first groups of astronauts were all male, not ever because NASA said that you had to be male to be an astronaut, but because, thanks to Eisenhower, who wanted to shortcut the process, to be an astronaut, to qualify, to even apply, you had to have jet flying experience, you had to have test pilot experience, and you had to have military experience. All three things of which women were not allowed to do. So the earliest astronauts were all men by definition, and many women, a number of women did apply, and they were summarily totally rejected. By 1976, NASA had not only read the handwriting on the wall, but had been handed a directive that said, you, NASA, like all the other government agencies, better get some women everywhere in this place, and minorities. So in 1976, NASA puts out a call for women and minorities, as well as pilots and commanders, for the upcoming new Space Shuttle program. And the Space Shuttle, unlike the little capsules that were going to go to the moon or go somewhere to get to the moon, the whole point of the shuttle program, as I'm sure you are perfectly well aware, was a much bigger vehicle, about the size of a Boeing 727, larger crews. The shuttle would go up, it would go around the Earth, around and around and around many times. It would do things while it was up there. There would be experiments, there would be scientific things done. They would build a space station, they would launch a space telescope. Then it would come back to Earth, and almost every part of the whole thing got reused. And because it was in this vehicle about the orbiter, about the size of a 727, there was room for much larger crews. John Glenn used to joke that the early space capsules, you didn't so much as climb in them as you put them on. They were very, very small, and it was a very compact situation. Suddenly in the shuttle, there's room for more people, and half the crew was not going to be flying. Half the crew was going to be doing things. So they put out the call for women and minorities scientists. They wanted scientists with great educational experience who could do some of this stuff. This, of course, is what opened the door to women and minorities, people like Sally Ride. Sally Ride did not grow up with astronaut dreams. She loved the space program, but never thought women could do it. She grew up in Southern California, loved science as a kid, learned how to play tennis. She was an amazing athlete, very trim, was so accomplished. She was on the junior circuit. She was moving into the women's pro circuit. She considered turning pro, In fact, dropped out of college for a few months to give it a shot. Didn't make it in her own mind, and so went back to science. And years later, people would say, Sally, what stopped you from becoming a professional tennis player? And she always said, my forehand, which was probably true. So Sally goes to Stanford. She gets her undergraduate, her master's, and her PhD in physics, astrophysics. And in January of 1977, she is committed to becoming a professor, an academic. She tells her high school best friend she wants to be famous. She wants to win the Nobel Prize. And instead, one January morning, she's at the Stanford Union, getting a coffee and a sweet roll to wake up before class. She picks up the Stanford Daily. Journalism is such an important part of this story. Picks up a copy of the Stanford Daily and never gets beyond the front page. Just above the fold, over on the right-hand side, she reads a headline that says, NASA to recruit women. Sally's future had just absolutely landed in her lap. She reads the article, she reads the job description for this new category of astronaut called mission specialist, says to herself, I can do that. Gets up, leaves the student union, goes and gets a piece of paper, an envelope, and a stamp, it was that long ago, and immediately, on the spot, sends off for an application. This is a woman who never planned ahead, who did what she did because she loved it, was entirely sure she would be a physics academic, and now all she wanted to do was become an astronaut. One article, one paper. Long story short, details, of course, in the book, Sally was one of more than 25,000 people who wrote off for that application. Some 8,000 people filled them in, including more than 1,500 women. And in the end, after a long process of screening and some very anxious moments, a year later, Sally was one of the 35 individuals chosen as the new class of shuttle astronauts. Of those 35, 6 were women, 3 African-American men, and 1 Hawaiian-American. NASA was suddenly looking like a poster child for multiculturalism, and Sally was ecstatic in her own way. Sally Ride was an introvert. She was very shy, but as she described it, when the phone call came telling her that she had been accepted, she jumped up and down in her room all by herself, calls up her best friend, the one she told she wanted to be the Nobelist, and says, hi there, this is your friendly local astronaut calling. Sally's parents shared the glory in their own idiosyncratic way. She used to joke that her father, who taught political science at a community college in Santa Monica, my father, she said, hasn't got a scientific bone in his body, never understood what to say when he explained that I was an astrophysicist. Now that I'm an astronaut, she said, his problems are solved. Her mother, the wonderful Joyce Ride, still with us at the age of 90, spun it differently. With Sally going to space and her sister studying to be a minister, Joyce Ride told reporters, one of them will get to heaven. So this is the background she grew up in. And then immediately, Sally, the graduate student, is exposed to us. She is exposed to the press. This woman who only knew about going to class and being in labs and sort of hunkering down suddenly is the subject of a press conference where she is stunned by the stupidity of questions like, aren't you afraid of being in orbit with all those men? And do you expect to run into any UFOs? This is 1978. We've already been to the moon and back, and these are the questions that are asked Sally, and by the way, the 5 other women. Sally calmly answered no to the latter and assured the former that her academic career as an astrophysics student had made her very comfortable around males. So, in view of all this, it will probably not surprise you that the two of us bonded when we first met. I was sent to Houston in January of 1981 to be part of the preps for the run-up to the first space shuttle mission, which launched in April of '81. This is January. And one of my first assignments was to interview a group of the so-called new breed of astronauts, the scientists, the women, the minorities. And we said to NASA, give us a few. Sally was one of the people they offered up. The two of us just immediately realized we liked each other and we thought the same. She spoke in English, not techno talk. She was direct, she was determined. I said to her at one point in my first interview, why do you want to go into space? And I thought I'd get this sort of cocksure response of the astronaut culture. I don't know, she answered. I've discovered that half the people would love to go into space and there's no need to explain it to them. The other half can't understand, and I couldn't bother to explain it to them. It was just great. It was great. And in this fraternity of uptight crew cuts, she was also a breath of fresh feminism, acknowledging unequivocally that without the women's movement, she would not be where she were. That, in fact, the women's movement and the social changes in this country had made her selection possible, and that NASA, with its 20-year heritage of white male fighter pilots, was finally doing the right thing. We became friends immediately. We spent a lot of time together. She married another astronaut. Their home became my beer and pizza hangout, and I must tell you, a number of people have said to me, how can you be friends with somebody that you're also covering? And the truth is, thank goodness it was 1980s and not now, because there was no 24/7 cable, there was no Twitter, there was no Facebook. If I had called up ABC and said, I just found out this interesting gossip about some astronauts, they would have said, that's nice, dear. And that would have been the end of it. I could barely get my stories on the air. And there was never any compromise. Sally and Steve, her husband, and I knew where the lines were. In fact, I did get some tips from them that were on the air that helped me in my reporting. But there was nothing I ever found out that was germane to anything we were doing that I did not report. So Sally got her chance to fly just 5 years later. She was selected as the first. Yes, I do think it was a competition among the women, but it was kind of a quiet competition because, in fact, nobody had a clue what NASA was going to look for to pick the first woman. Every single one of them was supremely, supremely talented and could have done the job. I think the choice of Sally was exactly the right choice. But when she was chosen, she got told all by herself, and then the rest of the crew got told, 4 men and Sally. And Chris Kraft, the director then of the Johnson Space Center, calls her up to his office and said, I hope you understand what being the first American woman in space, there were 2 Russian women who had gone before, what being the first American woman in space will entail. Are you prepared for that? Sally said, yes, sir, I think I am. There is no way she could have understood. There is no way she could have been prepared for us and for everything else that happened to her. But how do you not grab the brass ring when it's out there? So she now goes through a year of training and facing really awful questions from the press, who essentially still were treating women as this novelty, including the question that I would nominate for the dumbest question ever asked by a reporter at a press conference anywhere at any time. And I've been to a lot of press conferences. We're now in May of 1983. Sally's going to fly in June. We're at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. She's sitting up in the front of the room at the dais with the rest of her crew, 4 guys and Sally. A reporter from Time magazine raises his hand, says, Dr. Ride, I know you've been training for a year and that it's very intense, but I'd like to know what happens when something goes wrong in a training session, in a simulation. How do you handle it? Do you weep? I was sitting in the audience, and that's pretty much what I did. Here is why Sally was such a superb first American woman in space. I would have clawed the guy's eyes out. Sally took it all in stride. By the way, this exists on tape. You can see this. She starts to laugh. She rolls her eyes a little bit as if to say, who is this guy? She smiles. She turns to Rick Houck, the pilot of her mission, and she says to the audience, why doesn't anyone ever ask Rick those questions? Totally defusing what could have been a real bomb. Another male reporter actually asked Sally, did you ever wish you were a boy? Sally gritted her teeth and said, no, I never thought about it. Within NASA, there were a number of other hurdles to leap. The 6 women managed to get some of the items changed in the personal preference kit, the toilet kit that you took up in a loft. And they managed to get the Old Spice aftershave and the British Sterling deodorant exchanged for some more female-friendly lotions and potions. And thanks to the women, NASA added what only they could call hair restraints. We call them rubber bands. It wasn't just the press, and it wasn't just NASA. When the original launch date was moved back 2 months to accommodate a schedule change, Johnny Carson joked on The Tonight Show that the shuttle was being delayed so that Sally Ride could find a purse to match her shoes. Now, that actually was the funniest of all his lines. Over the course of a year, Johnny Carson, the humor devolved. It was frat house humor. It talked about her body, about her brassiere, about her deodorant, you name it. And I've now looked at all the clips. The audience, bless them, started out laughing, and then there was a little silence, and then there was groans, and by the end of the year, they were actually booing Johnny Carson when he told some of those jokes. What had happened was that NASA's selection and Sally's conduct had transformed female astronauts from a punchline to a matter of national pride. And I think a huge amount of it had to do with the integrity with which she handled herself. Her flight was important, she said, because it's something that a woman hasn't done before, and it's more evidence that women can do anything. This is what she said at the press conference. In those days, the mainstream media, I guess is what we are, the commercial networks got one-on-ones with the astronauts as well. So in my one-on-one with Sally afterwards, I said to her, so do you feel under pressure as the first American woman? She said, I do feel under pressure not to mess up. Sally was very succinct. She never elaborated, but I knew exactly what she meant. She didn't want to mess up for the mission because she really, every space mission is a team event, and she wanted to be good for them. She didn't want to mess up for NASA. She believed deeply in NASA and wanted us to be preeminent in space. She didn't want to mess up for the United States because the future of human spaceflight was very important, and for everybody else that was watching. But I think what she really meant about not messing up was she didn't want to mess up for other women, because she understood that if she did, then the next female astronaut they were going to look at and say, well, we can't send her because this other girl understands that without what the first women did, starting with Sally, it would have been much more difficult for them. But Sally was really good at what she did. The liftoff was magnificent, June 18th, 1983. It was a Saturday morning. I was anchoring by then. And I also took my mother, my then 80-year-old mother, to the liftoff. And Sally was, in a way, very lucky. You probably remember that shuttle liftoffs can get delayed and delayed and delayed, and you can watch, and at the last minute there's a glitch. Hers, flew twice. Both of hers flew perfectly. And so I had my mother there, and my mother came up afterwards, and she said, perfect. She said, it was perfect. I saw the horse and buggy. I saw the first airplanes, and now this. And she had gotten to know Sally because Sally and I were such good friends. And she said the fact that it was a woman and that it was Sally made it even better. So that was a great moment for me. When they landed a week later at Edwards Air Force Base in California, President Reagan telephoned his congratulations to the tarmac. He said to every one of them something special. To Sally, he said, somebody said that sometimes the best man for the job is a woman. You were there because you were the best person for the job. And there's absolutely no question about that. Millions of women around the world agreed. I think what happened is they translated Sally's bold journey into their own tickets to success. And the thinking was, if she can do that, I can do anything. This is 1983. Whether it was about getting out of the typing pool or getting into law school or getting into or out of a marriage or whatever, Sally became an icon, an inspiration. And I must tell you, I think she is a totally deserving, wonderful hero for all those reasons. She's exactly the hero you want for your daughters and your granddaughters and your great-granddaughters. She really was quite a terrific woman, a smart and witty and wonderful pal, And my image of Sally that I most like to remember is that the night before, the afternoon before her first flight, she was without a doubt the most famous person on the planet for 15 minutes, on the cover of every magazine. I was sitting in our ABC workspace in the trailer at the Kennedy Space Center, and astronauts at that point, right before they fly, are all quarantined, except from family members who get special physical examinations because they don't want any stray germs compromising the mission. So there's no human contact. And of course, there's no press contact. Everybody wanted to talk to Sally, off limits, off limits. I'm sitting in the ABC workspace getting my script done for Friday night's show. Phone rings, someone says, "Lynn, it's for you." I pick up the phone, a little voice says, "Hi there, what are you doing 5 minutes from now?" I said, "I don't know, Sally, what am I doing 5 minutes from now?" She said, "Why don't you walk outside your trailer, turn left, turn right on the gravel path and stop." So I said, okay, I did that. There, 50 yards away from me was Sally, wearing cutoffs, a t-shirt, flip-flops, standing by a car, waving and smiling, essentially saying, pushing the envelope a little. She wasn't supposed to make contact. This is Sally's little way of doing things, but also giving me a chance to say on the air that night that Sally Ride was in great shape and really looking forward to her mission. This is my image of Sally. I knew a lot about Sally. I didn't know a lot about her, it turns out. I am doing the book. You, I'm sure, all remember that when she died, the news that shocked a lot of the world was revealed in her obituary for the first time that she'd been in a relationship with another woman for 27 years. Sally's marriage had ended after 5 years. She and Steve remained friends. She entered into a relationship with another woman, Tam O'Shaughnessy, that was quite hidden from the world. There were some friends who knew. I did not. Sally used to stay with me in New York. She would visit me, never said a word that she was living with a woman. I think there were a lot of reasons for this. I think she was trying to protect NASA. I think that she chose as her issues, women's rights, women in sports. Title IX was one of her big issues. Science, protecting planet Earth. What she saw from space and saw the Earth, she really understood the fragility of this planet. I think this was just one of those issues she did not want to take on. So it was revealed in her obit that she was gay. And Tam, her partner, the next day, they lived in La Jolla, outside of San Diego. Tam and the family are there, and the helicopters are circling overhead, and a Fox News reporter comes to the front door, and Tam calls up her Sally and Tam wrote children's science books together. She calls up her literary agent and says, I think we need a proper biography of Sally. She never wanted one while she was alive, and I only know how to write children's books, she said, so let's find the right person to do this. The agent she called is a woman named Esther Newberg, who is not only my agent, but one of my closest friends. And the reason Sally had Esther as an agent is because 30-some years ago, when Sally wrote her first children's book, she called me up and said, I need an agent, who should I use? So I put her on to Esther. So Esther called me and said they want a biography. And I did think about it for 5 minutes. And I said, yeah, I would like to do this. So it's been 2 years of a labor of love and also very hard. I wrote the book as a friend and as a journalist, and I would have to say probably the journalist part comes first. I'm in the book because so much of what I lived through and covered is what made Sally's celebrity and her mission possible. Sally is almost 9 years younger than I am, and I, like many of you and Marlene and Grace, we kicked in a lot of doors, and Sally understood that without those doors being kicked in, she wouldn't be there. So I'm in it a lot, and I'm in it in terms of what I covered, and what I hope it is something that keeps Sally in the front of everybody's minds. She was a great woman, smart, funny, witty, wound up starting a company to get girls interested and committed to science, math, all the STEM technologies. She gave back. She was a terrific woman. She deserves to be the first American woman in space, and I will just briefly end by saying, and I wouldn't know any of this if I hadn't been a reporter. Thank you very much.